you know, I was at Molloy College this past Saturday to give the opening talk for Spring Awakening, not the musical, but the day on Buddhism, with many workshops by teachers, etc. Brad Warner was the keynote in the afternoon. Shinge thought that was a really interesting pairing. Yeah, but up in Syracuse. He did just write a new book. If you're familiar with Brad Warner, he's a Zen priest, American Zen priest, lived for 11 years in Japan, and knows Japanese, and very serious practitioner, but very interesting character at the same time. He's 52 years old now. He'd be the first one, and I talked about this with him during dinner afterwards. He'd be the first one to say we have to be a little cautious about too quickly trying to separate Zen from its Japanese incarnation as we try to make it American, which we must do, as Bernie Glassman has said very well too. And yet, to me, he's the perfect example of what it means be to Americanize Zen, because he's just a regular guy. He's a punk rocker, and he says, you know, that's what brought him to Zen is too. Both punk rock and Zen are about being real. Interesting. He also worked for the company, for the man who created Godzilla. And he still loves science fiction and monsters and dinosaurs. He even wrote it, make a dinosaur. When he signed my book, he drew a dinosaur in my book. He's so, you know, a serious practitioner while being very American at the same time. But his latest book is a commentary on the Shobogenzo, which is Dogen's primary philosophical work. Dogen, who is, you know, is the 13th century founder of Zen in Japan, or at least Soto Zen in Japan. And this is a very abstruse work. This is the first volume of 95 chapters. This has 21 chapters. Brad is basically retranslating this one, and this particular edition by Nishijima was actually his teacher, so he's making reference to this the whole time, and representing it in more, you know, somewhat more modern language, as you'll see. So what I'd like to do is just go over what is arguably admittedly the most important chapter, called Genjo Koan, which is, as well as he puts it, it's with the most important chapter in the book, and it may be the most significant philosophical piece Dogen ever wrote. So it's worth a look. As he says in a preceding chapter called Note to Self, there is no self, which is his usual way, Dogen's way actually, his contradictions, which are true. One of his books, Brad's books, which I love, is There is no God, and He's always with you. So as he points out very well, Aristotle in the West, you know, based all of Western thought on the principle of contradiction, logical. You can't be one thing and the same thing, opposite thing at the same time. And Dogen comes and says, oh yes, you can. In fact, that's the only way, best way to see reality. So there's the interplay between East and West there. So the basic point is there is no self. You know, the basic Buddhist doctrine and experience, human experience, if we really go into it, presented in various different ways, and we'll look at those now in this particular translation. First of all, when he points out, Dogen does, that, you know, when we've got the usual Buddhist mentality where there's the Buddha and there's, you know, ordinary people, there's illusion and enlightenment, there's training and results, there's life and death, and there are Buddhas and just plain folks, as he translates it here. Because we've still got these distinctions. But once everything is, when the zillions of things, the myriads of things he translates as zillions of things, and phenomena are seen as having no self, well then you don't make distinctions and separations anymore. There's not separation. So there's no misunderstanding or enlightenment, no illusion versus enlightenment, no Buddha or just plain folks, because you're not defining things separately from anything anymore. So once you're a Buddhist, Buddhism disappears. So once you're enlightened, enlightenment disappears, and that's a recurring theme. Because you're not defining things out anymore. It's all just it. So that's a really important thing. And that comes through in the Heart Sutra, as he does point out. And that's a preceding chapter here in Dogen, a commentary on the Heart Sutra, where it says there's no ignorance and no end to ignorance, no old age and death and no end to old age and death. Both are true at the same time. There's still everything that was, but you don't make the distinctions anymore, so it kind of disappears in terms of a separate reality, especially you as a separate reality. So that's just some of the contradictions you live with happily, whoever you are at that point. And who you are comes down to this arguably most famous paragraph in all of Dogen's writings. It's, to follow the way is to study the self. That's the first phrase. So in other words, it's not about external things or costumes or sutras or incense or Buddhas. It's about you. It's about what goes on inside. And I just gave a homily yesterday in church about one of my Carthusian confreres pointing out that conversion to the interior is the fundamental critical switch over in a person's life from both a psychological and a spiritual point of view. When you realize that the whole game is you, in the sense of, I don't mean egotistically or narcissistically, but that's where the battleground is, that's where the challenge is, that's where the transformation occurs, and everything else goes along with it. So it's to study the self. But, as he goes on to say, to study the self is to forget the self. In other words, you find there's no self. When you really study yourself, you find there is no self. How convenient, and how liberating. Again, and we'll come back to exactly how that's true in a moment, as Brad discusses it. But that self that you think you were falls away. Life and death, enlightenment, non-enlightenment. Because when you forget the self, this is Dogen again, is to forget the self is to be experienced by or to be united to the zillions of things, the myriad things. Remember, that's the Buddha's own experience at his enlightenment, according to the story. I and the great earth and all beings have found the way. So the I that's speaking then is not the I that sat down the evening before. The I is the great earth and all things at once. That's why when you forget the self as separate, which it's not, of course, you are united to the zillions of things. That's who you really are. As Bernie Glassman says, it's not so much a loss of self, it's just the expansion of self to what it truly is, and it is just it. Call it Buddha, call it Christ. Don't call it anything, just be it. It's to be united to the zillions of things, and when experienced by the zillions of things, is the last part of the phrase, our own body and mind drop away. So you're not aware of body and mind as separate entities, separate from themselves, or separate from anything else, or you as separate, or you as being that. They drop away. They're still there, but not the way they were. Which brings to what he says about the self in that chapter, which is interesting. We speak about the false self, as Richard Rohr often does, and the false self versus the true self. Brad says very well, it's not that, the individual qualities of who you are and who you are, it's not that they don't exist at all. They obviously do, or we wouldn't be sitting here. You wouldn't be sitting here, you wouldn't be talking, and you wouldn't be listening. And it's not either that we have to get rid of them, as if we could. All we have to do is make sure we don't pretend or be deluded into thinking that that's fundamentally or primarily who we are. Not be deluded into thinking that's the only game in town or the primary game in town, because it's insubstantial and transient, transitory, ephemeral. So that's all there, but that's not who you really are. It's your false self in that sense. And your true self is united to the zillions of things when body and mind fall away. How liberating. Dogen goes on to use famous images about firewood and ash This is the law of causality. Here we go back to more Western laws of thinking. There's a causality between cause and effect. So firewood catches fire and becomes ash. And Dogen is saying, no, there's firewood and then there's ash. Firewood doesn't become ash. Because the universe is instantaneous. It's all right here and now. So whatever it is it. Firewood or ash. But don't, in your mind, draw a connection between past and present and future. This becomes that. Or you were born and you die. That also, in the here and now, right here and now, is not true. So don't be deluded by cause and effect in past and present, past and future. The past and future are cut off, he says. Firewood and ash each have their own, the ash doesn't go back to being firewood. And human beings, when they die, don't come back to life again. Human beings, when they die, don't come back to life again. So there's a whole chapter after that about, did Dogen not believe in reincarnation? And he got all sorts of flack on his email from good Buddhists who were saying, of course he believed in reincarnation. He was a Buddhist. Well, it's really, I agree with both Brad and Dogen, that it doesn't matter. What matters is whether you're Christian or a Buddhist is what you're living right here and now. If you wake up now, then the rest will take care of itself, whatever it is. And you'll be fully alive, resurrected, Buddha mind, Christ mind, if you just wake up now. But it's true that both Christians and Buddhists misunderstand, what we even mean by rebirth or reincarnation. Sometimes it's taken to mean that, well, I'm the soul, I'm a spiritual, and I'm stuck in this body. When the body dies, I, my true self, my spirit, goes up somewhere and maybe comes down again in another body. That's nonsense! You are not separate from your body and soul. Those are not separate realities. There's just you here and now. One of the images that Brad quotes is, it's like a candle being passed to another candle, if you want to speak about rebirth. The flame is not the same, and yet there's a connection. Or the waves in the ocean, it's all the same water, and the waves are different, but it's all the same water. So if you want to understand it in those terms. But when I preach a funeral, I'm always telling people, stop with the idea that, okay, I'm the soul. When my body dies, if I've been a good boy or a good girl, I'm going to go up to heaven and wait around and finally get my body back and be the way I was. Nonsense! What about the cosmic Christ? What about the union with zillions of things? What about the communion of saints? What about the body of Christ, the Buddha mind, the Christ consciousness? And that's accessible now! Whatever you're hoping for or thinking will happen later is already here now. And if you start thinking about later, then you're going to miss it. In any case, there's no birth and death. It's just now. No past and future. So, another famous image right here. The moon reflected in the water, in the dewdrop. And the fathers of the church, the Christian fathers of the church, used this image too of the sun reflected in a puddle or in a drop of water, as God being in the soul, in our being. He uses that here too, the absolute and the relative. And he says, the moon doesn't get wet and the water isn't broken. In other words, the absolute doesn't lose itself in the relative, and the relative isn't destroyed by the absolute because their emptiness is form, and form is emptiness, and they're both right here now. So you're not going to be destroyed by being not separate from the absolute, and the absolute's not going to be diminished by being totally in you, right here and now. And there's a final koan which will illustrate that in a second. And finally, he has the famous image that's just used even by non-Buddhists contemporary about fish in the water and the birds in the sky. They're immersed in the water, they're immersed in the sky, and they don't realize that they are, but they're totally immersed in the whole thing is together. They're inseparable from everything. The medium they're swimming through, and you don't realize it. That's life, that's it. We're totally immersed in it. We're not separate from it. Just like the modern physicists are saying, you can't stand back and observe life. You are influenced by the observance of it, and you are changed by the interaction with it. It's all interrelated and all interconnected. Whoever you are is the whole. So the final story, the koan, that's put at the very end by Dogen to illustrate some of this point. The Zen master is approached by a student, and it's always, the poor student's going to get stepped on here. But of course, it's always a smart-ass student that they think they already know everything. He quotes, by the way, one of Brad's favorite lines of the whole thing is that when you get a little bit of enlightenment, you think you know it all. How often do we see that? But when you're really enlightened, then you know there's so much more that you still have to know. So anyway, the student comes along and thinks he's going to get the better of his teacher and says, since air is all over the place, so the teacher's there fanning himself on a hot day. This is not in one of the major collections, by the way. Since air is all over the place and goes everywhere, why are you using a fan? The master said, you only know abstract principles, right? You're just quoting some principle. That air is all over the place. You don't know that it goes everywhere. The monk said, okay then, what is the fact of its going everywhere? And the master replied by fanning himself. So get out of your head with these big principles and realize that the Absolute is right here and you're fanning yourself. You don't have to climb some mountain or go into a monastery. All you have to do is fan yourself or clean your breakfast bowl or whatever. And everywhere. That's it. Right then and there. You're away. Connected to the zillions of things, and it's not actually who's doing the fanning and what's the thing. Get the idea. So the final phrase that Dogen uses is, so when you really get it, the earth is manifest as gold. There's a big typo here. It says the earth is manifest as God. I think that's what he meant, because it says gold in the original. Anyway, bring that to his attention. Unless, I don't think he meant to say that. The earth manifests itself as gold and ripens the Milky Way into a delightful cheese. Dogen says that in the 13th century. The Milky Way, that we call the Milky Way galaxy, he refers to in Chinese and Japanese, it's the long river. The characters mean the long river. The long river becomes delightful cheese, or this curds and whey, some kind of delicious food. So the whole reality becomes sumptuous, becomes savory, becomes wonderful. The whole galaxy does, when you really get it. And then Brad couldn't stop himself from, he admits in a footnote, from adding his own little final words. He says, everybody likes cheese, right? Except vegans. Even most of them like it. They just don't like how it's produced, which I respect. So, it's all about waking up. So the Shobogenzo, I don't recommend it. You won't understand it. Brad says he read it 3-4 times before even, backwards even, before he even started to get it. It's very difficult. But maybe this particular translation will help you, because it is very profound and very direct, and about the way things really are. Any comments or questions before we resume? How many of you had ever even heard of the Shobogenzo? Right, some of you. Because I think I've mentioned it here before. I know I have. Okay, let's sit a few moments before we do the vow.